so much to Sean for his welcome to country and to CEDA for inviting me. This is a great honour. So I want to share with you some of my thoughts. I was asked to address the question, how could the state of WA improve the social and economic development of Aboriginal communities? So I acknowledge the Whadjuk traditional owners and their elders. Now, many of our thinkers and policymakers acknowledge the need to find a better approach to improve Indigenous social and economic outcomes to overcome the entrenched disadvantage. And my approach is much like several Aboriginal leaders. Perhaps some of you know Ian Trust in Kununurra. So we need to disincentivise poor economic behaviour and incentivise good economic behaviour. So how do we do that? In the context of the policy history that we've all inherited of a raft of failed policies and programs, and the landscape being one of mainly government-funded social enterprises and NGO service providers. Now, of course, there are some success stories, such as you'll know, for instance, that there's roughly about 300 Aboriginal businesses in the Pilbara, and that's because of the mining industry engagement with Indigenous people there, with some very good policies through the native title settlements and, of course, their employment and procurement policies. And some other parts of, especially mining areas in Australia, are not as good as that, but, you know, they're approaching that kind of development of Indigenous businesses. But in any case, the good news is that roughly about 50% of our Indigenous population in Australia has or is on the path to closing the gap, while the other half doesn't have much chance. But, you know, it's the more successful half, the workforce, the growing number of professionals, people with assets and savings who can contribute to the progress of the other half. So, for instance, the Forest Review report led by Andrew Forrest of this state noted that Indigenous businesses employ 100 times the people of non-Indigenous businesses. So it's that kind of incentive that I'm talking about. It's most important, I think, to do something about this huge build-up of jointly owned assets, native title, land rights, and other titles held by Indigenous people across Australia, hasten the resolution of contentious native title claims, and actually unleash the potential of these land assets. And particularly releasing the potential of the land access related payments. I said hello just now to my colleague Adam Levin, who lives here, and he came up with a brilliant idea a few years ago when we were organising seminars to bring the mining industry and traditional owners together with lawyers, economists, tax specialists, to find a way to unleash that potential. And his brilliant idea, which is now being picked up by the Minerals Council of Australia and the National Native Title Council, is the Indigenous Community Development Corporation. It's described in documents to Treasury and so on, in order to enable many of the trusts, the charitable trusts that have been set up as a result of land access payments, especially with mining companies, to transition from charitable trusts to a vehicle that allows the money to be used for investment and wealth creation purposes. So we need to develop investment strategies, but we need vehicles for that, and charitable trusts are not particularly effective vehicles for unleashing the potential of what is estimated to be, at a conservative estimate, about $12 billion in these Aboriginal trusts, and at a wild speculative end, some people say about 40 billion. I think that's a bit crazy. But in any case, even if the conservative estimate is 12 billion, these assets increase roughly by about $1 billion a year across the country. So there is a capital base, but it cannot be deployed because of the charitable trust regulations. So one of the big improvements in the last decade or so in the Indigenous situation is the engagement of the corporate sector, led by the mining industry, and Indigenous private sector participation. So during the mining boom, there was roughly about a 10% increase in Indigenous private sector participation. And that came about because of employment strategies and procurement policies, creating Indigenous supply chains. Now, that was underreported at the time because of, say for instance, an academic's obsession and even a policymaker obsession with the work for the dole schemes. Now, those work for the dole schemes in the past trapped Aboriginal people in a state of permanent poverty, and we are still, I think, faced with the challenge of levering people out of that poverty trap. And so the corporate sector and the private sector in general provide the best opportunities. So I recommend that every policymaker look at the Forest Review recommendations. There's a lot there that that can be used at the state level, not just at the Commonwealth level. So, for instance, the Commonwealth adopted, it says, most of the recommendations, although they watered them down and they ignored some. So anyway, the most successful one, really, and the most honest dealing with this incredible report was the Commonwealth Indigenous Procurement Policy. It sets a target over a period of years of about 3% of the Commonwealth procurement budget, which is roughly about $40 billion a year. Before this policy, less than 0.01% of the Commonwealth spend went to Indigenous businesses. That equated to about $6 million. Since the Commonwealth Indigenous Procurement Policy, modelled on the Forest Review recommendations, although watered down, there's been $150 million go in less than a year to Indigenous businesses from Commonwealth Government procurement. Now, I think every state and territory should have a procurement policy like this. I highly recommend the Northern Territory Remote Area Procurement Policy. That in the Northern Territory, in much less than a year, there's been an extraordinary increase, and you can see the increase in the employment in companies that have won tenders under the Northern Territory Remote Procurement Policy. So some people here are familiar with, say, empowered communities, Ian Trust's work, and there are other communities that are attempting to find a way to provide the Indigenous leadership, take responsibility, and create collaborative relationships with government and the private sector to pull Indigenous Australia out of what is really the result of a history of poor policy and poor understanding of the situation. So there are Indigenous leaders who are trying to shift Indigenous Australia from the welfare paradigm to the development paradigm. We need governments and the private sector to work with us in that regard. And we need to pay attention to creating market opportunities for individuals and families and concentrate less on the NGO, semi-corporatised Indigenous sector with all of its problems. And I think, we're certainly, I think, at the stage where we can debunk the presumption of Indigenous capacity. I think we're long past that. It's been many years, about 15 years since I've heard any comments like that at events like this. So how do we create pathways for the other 50% of Indigenous people to connect them to the economy? by creating individual opportunity pathways and using conventional market mechanisms is what works. We know it works everywhere. Employment, obviously, local or through orbiting, greater numbers of Indigenous entrepreneurs, and growing small Indigenous businesses into medium and large businesses. So I think our procurement policies, both government and private sector, can really make a huge improvement. So when Rio Tinto, BHP and FMG developed their procurement approaches to the local Aboriginal population of the Pilbara, they unleashed Indigenous entrepreneurialism almost immediately. I can remember it must have been about 2006-07. 16 companies had set up in 1 year. 5 years later, there were 140. And then by the end of the boom, there were about 300 businesses. And some of them, I think, are going to be around for a long time, even with the end of the boom. So we need to, I think I've lost, oh, okay. With these charitable trusts and large successful Indigenous corporations, they've got a critical role in promoting wealth creation for the tribe as a whole, rather than being passive investments or purely social enterprise operators. How to improve the productivity of these trusts, these jointly owned assets. So we need good management, so that means the Indigenous sector and the charitable trusts have a responsibility to train people in financial literacy, leadership, good management, good governance. We need prudential controls and investment strategies, short, medium and long term. And I think, you know, in particular, say, for instance, to address the net present value of those trusts. There's I think, a mistaken belief, or originally certainly there was, especially in the mining industry, that by letting these funds accumulate or increase with, you know, the exponential growth of yearly payments, that would create a fund for the beneficiaries in the future. But we all know that the net present value is the key factor, because the funds will be worth so much less in the future than they are now. So how do we invest them now to create more wealth creation? And so we need, I think, a more aggressive approach to this problem, and that means bringing the trusts together with, say, CEDA or the Department of Regional Development or experts, and there are many experts in this room I see, to help people unpack these barriers, to become financially literate, to see the potential that they manage or actually transfer the management of to professional fund managers. There are sustainable reforms so I think there have been attacks, and many of you will know about this, on these trust funds as if they're government funds. They're not, the private funds. But how can we help people to use those funds in a sustainable way and to create more wealth? I've talked a little about the MCA NNTC proposal, Minerals Council of Australia National Native Title Council proposal for an ICDC, but there are other options as well. I think we need a smorgasbord of options, because big successful trusts could operate with more complex structures very successfully. They should be training their members in leadership, in financial literacy, investing in and designing customised education and health services. Say, for instance, at Roebourne there's a hospital. I went in there a few years ago and I spoke to a Sri Lankan doctor. He told me that nobody from the local community would come in to see him. And I just couldn't understand it, and he couldn't understand it. And I think, you know, Aboriginal people alienate themselves from institutions because of the history of some of these places, but it's no longer necessary. So we need some smart innovators, some disruptors, to break down those social barriers, not just, the problem of racism, but also the problem of Aboriginal self-exclusion. So why aren't they using the hospital? In fact, why don't they talk to the health department about co-owning it and co-managing it and feeling some ownership over it? And I think also deliberating on poorly negotiated native title agreements and renegotiating employment and business development opportunities, because the door's wide open for that in many ways. We need land reforms, we need land titling, because you can't do anything without hard assets, fungible assets. We need the cooperation of state agencies and honest, fair dealings with traditional owners, native title holders and landowners to seek land titling through cadastral mapping, local title holding entities according to local aspirations, excuse my terrible typing, and allotments for housing and business development eventuating from the native title landscape. I don't think it's that hard. I note that Minister Nigel Scullion, the Federal Minister for Indigenous Affairs, has already achieved this twice in the Northern Territory. So there are two models in communities, one with the Gumatj and another with at a place called Bunyala, both in Arnhem Land, where impressive local leaders have simply insisted on land titling. And it's not that hard to do. People imagine that it's so difficult. Not at all. So we need a business case, not just for the trust, but also for land titling, and that needs to be done on a local and regional basis. And leaders like Ian Trust, for instance, I think are the people, and there are many like him, are the people to talk to, because we've all had discussions about these approaches. He's the kind of person you can talk to, and I think, this could happen very quickly. This will be a game changer. A big issue is superannuation. Do you know that because of the years of the work for the dole, all of those tens of thousands of Aboriginal people have no superannuation? So I think in all of these subsidised work schemes, work for the dole schemes, there must be superannuation, because that is one of the big gaps in Aboriginal wealth. Am I being asked to stop?
Close.
Okay. Moreover, I think finally, the most important thing of all is budget and policy stability. There have been too many wild changes for far too long, and nobody can get any work done. So can we please have some budget and policy stability? We need federal-state cooperation under partnership arrangements with milestones agreed, and we need bipartisanship. This is a very difficult job. I've been annoying people for about 45 years on these issues, and I've pretty much run out of time. We can't hand this enormous problem over to the next generation without handing over a solvable problem, a problem where we can say we've got this far, so we can almost say we've got 50% of the way. Now we're handing over the other 50% to you, but we think this will work, and we've worked with Aboriginal people to resolve these issues. So, I think it's good to hand over good policies, good infrastructure, and most of all, good collaboration. Thank you.